Hey there, learners. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to, well, being genuinely well-informed. We plunge into complex topics, pull out those essential nuggets of insight, and today we're tackling a real titan in international relations, a book that didn't just explain global politics, it actually fundamentally redefined how we understand power, conflict, and that, elusive pursuit of peace between nations.
We're talking about Hans G. Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations, The Struggle for Power and Peace. And it's really not just some dusty academic turd on gathering dust on a shelf.
No, not at all. It's foundational. It profoundly shaped global thinking, especially coming out of World War II, staring down the Cold War. Just immense upheaval.
Yeah, and it's truly remarkable, actually, how much of our current understanding of how states behave, even decades later, you can trace it directly back to Morgenthau's ideas, which were often quite challenging ideas.
So our mission today, let's unpack this seminal work. Explore the influences, the dramatic, personal, and historical influences that shaped it, its core arguments, which can be unsettling, and its enduring impact, sometimes controversial too.
Right. We've got some excellent analysis to guide us, distilling the key concepts, the influences, the whole legacy of Morgenthau's work.
So yeah, buckle up. It's a deep dive into the very nature of power on the global stage, and why it might be more complicated, maybe more tragic than you first think. Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. Who was this Hans J. Morgenthau, the man behind these, well, very influential ideas?
Well, he was born in Germany in 1904, a Jewish scholar, his early life steeped in the intellectual world of Weimar Germany. But then, crucially, he witnessed firsthand the terrifying rise of Nazism.
And he had to flee, right, in the 30s.
Exactly. Forced to flee, he travels through Spain, which itself was engulfed in its civil war, another brutal conflict. And he finally emigrates to the United States in 1937.
Wow, so that experience must have...
Oh, absolutely. You see, his personal journey wasn't just biography. It profoundly shaped his entire intellectual framework. Having seen nationalism destroy nations, ignite global wars, lead to the murder of millions, he became deeply skeptical of utopian ideals in politics.
Understandable.
Yeah. He came to believe, almost viscerally, in the absolute political importance of maintaining a balance of power between nations, a careful, often precarious balance.
And he ends up in the U.S.
Lands at the University of Chicago. And that's where he writes and publishes Politics Among Nations in 1948. Right at the dawn of the Cold War. So it's very much a response, you could say, to the turbulent world he'd lived through.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Let's get to the heart of it. His central argument, the core of realism, as it became.
Right, and it's deceptively simple at its core. Morgenthau argues that relations between nations are fundamentally at their irreducible core defined by a desire to accumulate the greatest possible amount of power. It's just this relentless, ongoing struggle.
A struggle for power.
Yeah, and if we zoom out a bit, realism posits that states pursue what are called relative gains.
Relative gains.
Yeah.
Meaning compared to others.
Exactly. It's not just about wanting more power in absolute terms. They want to increase their power in comparison to other states. Why? Because in an international system with no central authority, what Morgenthau and other realists call anarchical, this relative power is seen as the only real guarantee of security.
Okay, so like a schoolyard with no principal,
Yeah.
the biggest kid feels safest. That kind of logic.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. That's the state system for realists. No higher power to appeal to.
And he traces this back to something really fundamental, doesn't he? Human nature itself.
He does. He believed in something called animus dominandi.
The spirit of dominating.
Precisely. The spirit of dominating. He argued that humans, just by their nature, have this inherent drive to pursue power, domination over others. And crucially, statesmen, politicians, leaders, they're human, so they inevitably carry this deep-seated drive onto the world stage.
So for Morgenthau, that's why conflict is just baked in, not an accident.
Exactly. It wasn't an anomaly or a policy mistake. It was a defining, almost inescapable force in international relations, built into the very fabric of how humans interact when organized into states.
But he wasn't the first person to think along these lines.
Oh, not at all. That's a crucial point. He didn't just invent this. He drew heavily on a long, rich, and often, let's be honest, quite cynical tradition of political thought going back centuries, millennia even.
Like Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian.
Thucydides is a classic example. His Million dialogue It's chilling, really. It encapsulates that brutal logic of power politics. Remember the line? The dominant exact what they can, and the weak concede what they must.
Yeah, no room for justice there when you're facing overwhelming strength, just cold calculation.
Precisely. Then you fast forward to the Renaissance, Niccolo Machiavelli in Italy.
The prince.
Right. And Machiavelli wasn't interested in how leaders should ideally behave. He wanted the effectual truth of the matter, how they actually behave. And he observed, famously, that humans are ungrateful, fickle simulators and deceivers.
Doesn't paint a pretty picture.
Not at all. Which led him to conclude it's much safer for a ruler to be feared than to be loved. The national interest, the raison d'etat, reason of state, meant you had to prioritize power and preserving the state above all else, even if that meant ditching conventional morality sometimes.
And then there's Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes in England.
Yes, Hobbes and his Leviathan. He described that hypothetical state of nature, no laws, no authority, human nature, greedy and violent life. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Right. And his solution was a powerful state, the Leviathan, to keep order.
Exactly. Because in that lawless realm, the only rules are the rules of power. So Morgenthau explicitly picks up this thread. He recognizes, quote, international politics is of necessity power politics. It's just the reality of the situation.
But you said earlier he saw it as a tragedy, not just cynicism.
Yes, and this is a crucial layer, often missed. He saw this constant struggle for power as a tragedy, not just a cold formula. Why tragic? Because humans, with their moral hopes, their desire for peace, are kind of trapped in this inherently insecure system where conflict is always a possibility.
So his book wasn't meant as a how-to guide for dictators.
Not at all. He viewed it more as a sobering guide on the limitations of power. And maybe surprisingly, the enduring importance of ideas, of morality, even in a world driven by power. He thought understanding the tragedy was the first step towards maybe managing its worst effects.
Okay, but this kind of stark realism, it wasn't exactly popular everywhere, right? Especially after World War I, when people were hoping for something better.
Oh, definitely not universally accepted. The field of international relations, which was just sort of emerging then, was really defined by this great debate, as they called it, between the idealists and the realists.
Idealists like Woodrow Wilson.
Wilson is the classic example, yeah. He fervently called for international cooperation, global institutions, his 14 points, the push for the League of Nations. That was all based on the belief that states could make rules, cooperate in good faith, build a world based on law, not just might, collective security, shared values. That was the dream.
But not everyone bought into that dream. You mentioned Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian.
Right. Niebuhr profoundly disagreed. He had this very influential argument. While individuals might aspire to love and serve each other, groups, and especially nations, tend to take for themselves whatever their power can command.
Oof.
Yeah. Niebuhr saw that Wilsonian faith in international rules as, well, dangerously naive, almost a tragic self-delusion. He thought the moral limits and self-interest of humans just get magnified when they form powerful groups like states.
So Morgenthau jumps into this debate.
Straight in.
Yeah.
And aligns strongly with Niebuhr's perspective. He saw idealism as dangerously naive, especially after the League failed and World War II happened. He shared that view of humans as, well, predisposed to selfishness when unchecked.
And for him, the state's main job was
protect itself, increase its power. That was the national interest. And he argued the state had, quote, no right to let abstract moral ideas or, ideological crusades get in the way of protecting its citizens.
So morality is secondary.
In the realm of state action, yes. It didn't mean morality was irrelevant for individuals, but for the state navigating the international system, survival and power came first. It operated on a different plane, you might say.
Okay, so given all these influences, Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Niebuhr, his own experiences, what made Morgenthau's approach really original? Why did his book become so defining?
Well, a key thing was his ambition. He aimed to present a genuine theory of international politics, something that would, as he put it, bring order and meaning to all these complex, seemingly chaotic global events.
A theory, not just observations.
Exactly. And crucially, he wanted this theory to be empirical and pragmatic, tested against observable evidence, real-world stuff, unlike a lot of earlier work that just made big assertions without really rigorously checking them against the facts.
But he wasn't trying to make politics a hard science, like physics.
No, and that's fascinating. He was quite cautious about applying the scientific method directly to politics. He argued politics couldn't be a science like physics. Drop an apple, it always falls. Politics isn't like that.
Too many variables, too unpredictable.
Precisely. He said the complexities of international affairs make simple solutions and trustworthy prophecies impossible. So his focus was on understanding the fundamental forces driving politics between nations' forces he believed were rooted in that consistent, if flawed, human nature.
But always acknowledging the context.
Always. He talked about the filter of real circumstances, meaning, the specific historical moment, the personalities of the leaders involved, sheer chance. All that could change how those fundamental forces played out. It's about understanding the deep currents, not predicting every single wave.
And you mentioned earlier something often overlooked is his view on morality and law. He didn't just dismiss them.
No, not at all. Despite the focus on power, he actually placed significant emphasis on morality and international law as limits on power. He talked about the tragic presence of evil in all political action.
Meaning leaders sometimes face only bad choices.
Kind of, yeah. Difficult choices where any option might have negative moral consequences. But he also acknowledged that moral feelings operate within the consciences of individual men. He didn't deny morality's role, he just saw it operating within that messy, often contradictory reality of power politics. Often secondary to national interests, yes, but still present, a constant tension.
Right. Not an outright rejection, more like a difficult balancing act.
Exactly, a balancing act.
Okay, so Morgenthau establishes this classical realism.
Yeah.
But things change, right? Especially after the Cold War.
They do. The world got a lot more complex than just the US versus the Soviet Union, and this led to new takes on realism. In the 70s and 80s, Kenneth Waltz's neorealism, sometimes called structural realism, became hugely influential.
What was Waltz's main idea?
Waltz shifted the focus. He argued state behavior is primarily driven not by human nature or internal state politics, but by the structure of the international system itself, especially its anarchy, the lack of world government, and how power is distributed within that system. He felt you couldn't understand world politics simply by looking inside of states. The system constrained them.
But then the Cold War ended. Suddenly, 1991. How did Waltz's theory handle that?
Well, that was a bit of a problem, frankly. His structural theory struggled to fully explain such a rapid, fundamental shift. If the system's structure was the main driver, why did it change so dramatically?
Good question.
Exactly. And that analytical puzzle helped lead to the emergence of what's called neoclassical realism in the 1990s.
Okay, neoclassical, so mixing the old and the new.
Kind of, yeah. It tries to bridge the gap to reconcile Morgenthau's original classical realism with its focus on internal factors, leadership, and Waltz's neorealism. It argues state behavior is influenced by both the international distribution of power, yes, and by domestic factors.
Like what kind of domestic factors?
Things like public opinion, political institutions, ideologies within the state, and crucially, the individual perceptions and ideas of the leaders themselves. It acknowledges that internal stuff and leaders' choices really do impact foreign policy, which, brings us right back to Morgenthau's more nuanced view. It brings the human element back in.
So it sounds like Morgenthau's core ideas, maybe in these updated forms, are still very relevant today. We see them in policy debates.
Oh, absolutely. Very much alive. For instance, John Neerheimer, a leading realist theorist today, famously used Morgenthau's principles to critique the Iraq War.
How is so?
He argued against that whole neoconservative idea that a state like the U.S. should identify its own moral goals, like spreading democracy, with universal moral laws, and then act on them globally, maybe through force. Mearheimer, channeling Morgenthau, said confusing your ideology or your domestic moral crusades with the hard-headed assessment of national interest is dangerous.
Dangerous because
It risks overreach, getting bogged down, unintended consequences, and ultimately weakening your actual security and power. Sticking to the national interest, defined primarily as power and security, is safer in their view.
and we see it in analyzing current trends, too, like shifts in U.S. power.
Definitely. There's a contemporary scholar, Kevin Marsh, who uses neoclassical realism to look at what some call the humbling of American power. He argues that domestic factors, things like the 2008 financial crisis, political gridlock in Washington, public war weariness after Iraq and Afghanistan, all these internal things constrain U.S. foreign policy choices.
So even if the U.S. still has immense power internationally, domestic issues limit how it can be used.
Exactly. Marsh suggests this leads to more reliance on security cooperation, working with allies, maybe less unilateral action, even as the world becomes more multipolar. It's a perfect example of domestic variables shaping external behavior, just as neoclassical realism, and indeed Morgenthau himself, would suggest.
Okay. But it hasn't all been smooth sailing for realism. There have been critiques, right?
Oh, yes. Very significant critiques, and it's important to address those. J.N. Tickner, a really prominent feminist scholar, made a famous argument that Morgenthau's theory, and realism more broadly, is deeply embedded in a masculine perspective.
What does she mean by that?
She argued it tends to see power primarily as domination, and in doing so, it overlooks or devalues other crucial concepts in human relations, like sharing, cooperation, interdependence. She also pushed for a more multidimensional view of national interest, one that might include things like human security, environmental protection, cultural understanding, not just military power.
Was she trying to just tear down realism?
No, and that's important. Her stated aim wasn't to reject realism entirely, but rather to complete it, to offer a fuller, more inclusive picture of human interaction on the global stage, one that acknowledges perspectives and dynamics that traditional realism might miss.
That's a really interesting point. So what a journey we've taken here from Morgenthau's own harrowing experiences in Europe.
Yeah, deeply shaped by that turbulence.
To writing this book that then shapes generations of scholars, policymakers. Politics among nations is it's still a cornerstone, isn't it, for understanding global power.
It truly is. His book didn't just define how we think about state interactions. It really established realism as a primary way, the primary way for a long time, to theorize about international relations. And it also pushed for a more systematic, empirical approach to studying it all. It created a framework people still grapple with.
And it's fascinating how, despite its reputation for being all about raw power,
Yeah, the cynical view.
our dive today showed it's actually more nuanced. It highlights that complex interplay with morality, with law, even acknowledging that tragic presence of evil in all political action. It sort of forces you to grapple with the harsh realities, but without completely giving up on the human desire for something better.
I think that's right. And Morgenthau's ability to weave in those other elements, the importance of ideas, morality, the perceptions of individual leaders, that was really ahead of its time. It's why his work still sparks so much debate and research today. It reminds us that even in a world obsessed with power, human choices, ideas, and aspirations still matter profoundly.
So for you, the learner, thinking about all this, the question remains, how much of what you see in international politics today is truly driven by that raw power and self-interest Morgenthau described? And how much is shaped by shifting ideas, evolving identities, the moral compasses, however flawed, of the people and nations involved?
And maybe even more importantly, how do we tell the difference when we look at the complex world stage today?
Something to keep pondering, keep learning. And we'll be back soon for another deep dive.